Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. Welcome. My name is Shannon Supple, and I'm curator of rare books, part of the Mortimer Rare Book Collection and Special Collections here at Smith College. I'm so happy you're all here today. I want to start with a land acknowledgement. Lectures with online components mean we stand on different lands as we join in community. I and others in this room today are on Nonotuck land, people who live and create here since time immemorial and continue to do so. You can learn more and support Indigenous work through maindigenousagenda.org. That's maindigenousagenda.org. A few words on logistics. We are live in person and on Zoom and are recording the session. If you're attending in person, please hold your questions for the Q&A to follow. If you're attending on Zoom, please add your questions to the Zoom's Q&A feature. My colleague, Leslie Fields, will be managing the Zoom questions. Thank you so much, Leslie. After the talk, I invite all in-person attendees to join us for a reception in the Poutel Day Poetry Center in Wright Hall in the adjacent building just over that way. A quick note of thanks. Thank you all for being here today. Thank you to Book Studies Concentration Director Lily Gerton-Wachter and Administrative Coordinator Yona Kimball-Smith, my Smith College Libraries colleagues Taya Dempsey, Leslie Fields, Sam Smith, Bina Williams, and Beth Myers, and Information Technologies Jeff Hirsch and Sanford Cluett for their help in making today's program possible. The annual Enid Mark Lecture on Contemporary Book Arts and Poetry was created in honor of artist, writer, and publisher Enid Mark, Smith College class of 1954. Enid studied English literature and studio art at Smith, where she pursued painting, printmaking, and photolithography. In 1986, she founded the Elm Press and was passionate about words and imagery and was deeply thoughtful about all aspects of her books. Smith College Special Collections is lucky to steward many of her books, and I invite you to explore them during our reading room open hours here in Nielsen Library. We're grateful to Enid and her family, including her late husband, Gene, and her son, Peter, for envisioning and enabling this lecture series to happen. So I want to introduce very quickly Professor Lily Gerton-Wachter, Associate Professor of English Language and Literature and the Director of the Book Studies Concentration, and our fellow sponsors for this lecture today. And then Lily will take it from here. So onward to you.
Thank you, Shannon. Hi, everybody. And I also just want to extend my thanks to Shannon, who did so much work to make this possible. So it is a great pleasure to welcome Jen Bervin to Smith. I've been wanting to bring her here since I joined the Book Studies Concentration because her work really exemplifies for me some of the most exciting possibilities in the study of and art of the book, challenging our ideas of what a book is, of what it means to read and write, and of how literature and art might touch us or how we might touch it differently. Bervin's work is difficult to summarize or explain quickly, ranging in scale from River, the 230-foot hand-sewn scale model of the Mississippi in sequins, to the silk poems fabricated on nanoscale and a biosensor made from liquefied silk. Bervin attends with great rigor and care to the forgotten and obscured intimacies between text and textile, poetry and skin, science and art, marginalia and meaning, creativity and loss. Her work is an important reminder of the materiality and tactility of both literature and art. Not only, as we so often forget, insisting that there is something to touch and feel in those so often cerebral or untouchable realms, but also of the spaciousness, intimacy, and new kinds of thinking for which touch makes room. Committed to extraordinary research and an ethos of collaboration, Bervin's work takes seriously the entangled interdisciplinary relationships and histories of the writing, fabric, and other archival scraps with which we live. I first encountered Bervin's work through her book Nets, a series of erasure poems of Shakespeare's sonnets. Finding the net in the sonnet, Bervin tangles her own poetry with that of Shakespeare, Where he writes the famous "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day" sonnet, she finds the sparse address, "Thou wanderest in shade in lines to time." In another that I saw come across my social media feed on Monday, among all the photos of eclipses, she forms from and with Shakespeare the lines "eclipses in sense and need." But this is a simplifying way to describe the work Bervin offers, because when you read Nets, you can read both Bervin and Shakespeare at the same time, in different colored fonts, layered upon each other like the sun and the moon lining up briefly and then departing from each other. In an interview with Bomb magazine, Bervin explains that she doesn't like the term erasure poetry. Quote, "It bothers me because I'm trying to make poems that point to the fact that many voices can be present in a text. I find the idea that we write alone laughable, even egotistical. Poetry is a palimpsest that has been endlessly rewritten. It's a social space we share with others." Whether written on an envelope or on silk biosensor, poetry for Bervin is not the ingenious creation of a single author trying to reach an audience from their solitary perch. Rather, it is a collaborative, social, research-driven process that from the start is inextricable from the material and historical processes and conditions that make writing and reading possible. Jen Bervin has a very long list of accomplishments, so I'll just highlight some. Her work has been exhibited internationally at Momenta, the Hong Kong University Museum and Art Gallery, the Ian Potter Museum of Art in Melbourne, the Power Plant in Toronto, MassMocha, the Morgan Library, and more. Her books include Gorgeous Nothings, Emily Dickinson's envelope poems with Marta Werner, which was a Book of the Year selection by The New Yorker, Silk Poems, a New Museum Book of the Year and a finalist for the Lambda Literary Award, Nets, and many others. She frequently creates artist books in collaboration with Granary Books, and I think we have all of those in special collections. A monograph publication titled Jen Bervin, Shift, Rotate, Reflect Selected Works was published in conjunction with the first survey exhibition of her work. And her work can be found in more than 60 international collections, including the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, Yale University, the Brooklyn Museum, and the J. Paul Getty Museum. So please join me in welcoming Jen Bervin to Smith.
All right. Thank you, Lily. Thank you, Shannon. Thank you to this great audience. Hold on, let me see you. It's really a incredibly talented room full of humans that I'm very excited to see. So thank you for coming, and thank you, Zoom world friends out there, for making time. I hope I'm joining you in your dinners and so forth. All right, so I'm working from 2 computers, so things are going to get exciting pretty quickly. So I'm going to start sharing my screen, and hopefully nothing blows up. So I thought I'd show you some images of the river. So it's another 12 years project, and it took me as long to sew the river as it would to walk it. 1 inch to 1 mile. I wasn't sewing all 12 years, however. I was doing a lot of things in those 12 years. It's a geocentric scale model of the Mississippi River. And so it's an inverted perspective. The viewer is looking up at the river on the ceiling, and their perspective is from inside the earth looking up at the riverbed. Here's an installation view. And the delta is mirrored. So as you approach, you can see the space and yourself reflected in the piece. So it changes dramatically depending on where it's exhibited, whether it's it's conforming to the space it's in, and it's mirroring the space and the people as well. So it really changes a lot. And it takes about 100 feet by 20 feet of space for it to work its whole length. I spent a lot of time sewing sequins, and so I had a lot of sort of material fluency with them. The sequins that I used were cloth, and they were foil stamped, so they were unique unto the sequin world. I know that they were made in France because they had a little tag that said so, but I didn't know much about them other than that. And I had a fellowship at Northwestern University while I was finishing it up for the show in Des Moines. And I had the opportunity to use a scanning electron microscope. That's the middle of the sequin, the hole in the middle. And it makes these sort of, these point samples that will show you what the materials are in the sampled area. The stub, incidentally, that you put a sample on is exactly sequin size. Like what you need to sample for the microscope. So it felt really right. And the sequin readout confirmed that it is silver. And it also confirmed that my touch, the residue of my touch is actually, surprising to me, chlorine. That's the residue of human touch on a sequin. So who knew? I think we're going to need a little power cord for my reading. We'll see. If it dies at this point, it's okay. All right. I've spent a lot of time with the poet Emily Dickinson for reasons that are wonderful and absorbing and strange and frustrating to me. I recently had the survey show, and so I had some time to reflect on what those works are doing and how long I've spent thinking about her work. And I had a long conversation with the poet and intellectual Claudia Rankine that really led me to reflect on the materiality of the works that I was creating and the works that I was creating it from. And the quilt series is made on a surface of cotton batting. And as it turns out, the paper, I used that material so that it would look like a magnified page, but as it turns out, the actual paper she worked on was also cotton and a mix of cotton and linen. And having spent many years researching silk and the material history of silk, it suddenly was a turn where I thought, like, how do I not know anything about her paper? Like, it's literally what she makes her work on. So this long series of quilts, which was really focused on the variant system, was asking this question all along. And it took me a while to hear it. I went back and restarted the quilts after that conversation. And this is a view of fascicle 10. It's the first fascicle, Dickinson. Fascicle is just a packet of poems. And what I'm doing in this work is I'm excerpting all of the handwritten marks that Dickinson makes, the crosses and the dashes, the question marks, and I'm compositing a whole packet's worth of poems into one visual plane, and embroidering them with red silk on a surface that's machine sewn to mirror the page, so the laid lines of the paper, the rules of the paper, etc. In fascicle 10, she is doing all this underlining, and it's something that doesn't happen, oh yes, in any of the other fascicles on that scale. And my theory is that it's the variants coming into being. Like, there are just a few at the top of that image, like that little cluster of 3 and the one over there. but I sense like it's a sort of like, like Marta Werner writes about in her essay, this sort of like ache before migration, like something is happening in sort of the body of the page that is moving in that direction. Like it's moving, it needs to do something that it's not doing yet. So the underlines are, thank you. Thanks. The underlines are kind of showing the need, I think, for the page to do something beyond what it's been doing up until that point. And the embroidered text is a variant. It says, of such proportion to me, so signal. And as I've gone back into the quilt series, I've tried to really ask specific questions of each quilt I'm making and what it can show about the variance system, what kind of questions it can ask. This is fascicle 28, and that's just one variant cluster that comes at the end of the poem. The variants are connecting to other language in the poem that's been marked with a cross as well. So you do this sort of weird process of reading backwards into the poem when you hit the variants, because you have this sort of unnumbered selection or sort of array of language at the end that connects, but it's not apparent exactly how it connects. So it reverses the, it's like that quote, from her work. Have you ever read one of her poems backwards? Because the plunge from the front overturns you. I sometimes, oftentimes, many times have, as something overtakes the mind. I'm going to come back to the material history part. I haven't forgotten, but I'm going to take a roundabout way through an artist book that came out last year. I'm a big fan of all of the editorial versions of Dickinson's work, the concordance in particular. I love going, to me, it sort of acts like a composite. It gives you a way in through a specific word into the entire array of her work. So I love to read that way when I have something in my mind. And I should say that a concordance is something that a major author gets. Not every writer gets them. And it's a way to index every use of a word in Dickinson's poems, and then there's a separate concordance for the letter, to the degree that letters are separate from poems, which it's very wild and blurry when you get into it. But the concordance was made in the 20th century, and it was one of the first computerized concordances out of Cornell. And so it was made on IBM punch cards. And when you look up the IBM 704 computer, you usually get that image of, these two people in a room. And I started to question that image. It's definitely a publicity image. And I started to really delve deeper into the history of the IBM 704. And as it turns out, it was the Social Security Administration that saved IBM from bankruptcy by giving them the government contract to build out the computer infrastructure for the Social Security system. And the Social Security system was built out mostly by Black women in Baltimore. And so the social safety net of the US, I credit to Black women. I think it's really important that they don't disappear in the image of the 704, that sort of, weird, singular, usually just one white man leaning over a computer. And from a textile perspective, the punch card is a big deal to me because that is how complex looms work, actually. The jacquard is the invention of the binary system. It's the pre-computer computer. So it means that this concordance was built kind of like a textile in how it thought, and it was typed onto punch cards and then transferred into magnetic tape and then indexed by the computer that way. So the artist book has like a big magnetic strip on it that gestures towards that. It has a punch card that's actually part of the book. And then this is a page spread. But that's a long way to say that I actually created an addendum to the concordance. The concordance is like this big, and the artist book is like this big. So it's just like really like sore thumb that sticks out in a way when you're thinking about corrections. And the scale is determined by my typewriter. So I typed it on my IBM Wheelwriter using the manifold font, and the scale, I use the exact format of this page space of the concordance to dictate the page space at scale. I'm obsessed with scale, if you haven't figured out. And I also did all the research for the word no, which was omitted from the concordance of the poems and the letters. Incidentally, she used it 395 times. Yes is included, she used that 4. And I find it really beautiful to read as its own sort of odd text. And I love the formatting of it, which also looks very textile to me. So it was a pleasure to research, a pleasure to type, and a pleasure to share. I also wrote a lot of mini essays, or what I called essayettes, for the book, and really delved into the history of the labor for the concordance and the history of labor and IBM 704. So there's a lot in there. You have it. It's all yours. Please spend your own time with it. All right, so this is my last little chapter, and then I'm going to stop and open it up for questions. I am obsessed with something called embossments, and they're found on a lot of Dickinson's manuscripts, as are they found on a lot of 19th century, mid-century manuscripts. And like that little image in Silk poems, it's something that you can miss on the page even when you're looking for it, especially as you toggle back and forth between reading, looking, and tilting. So I love the thing that disappears in plain sight that has a lot to say, and trying to bring that forward. So I don't know exactly where I'm going with this, but I have a really cool collaborator named Deborah Mayer, who's one of the most senior conservators at Weissman Preservation Center at Harvard. And she knows a lot about 19th century paper and is working on a very, very cool new development to do non-invasive paper research. So right now, if you're trying to study paper fibers, you have to physically remove them, dye them, stain them, look at them under a microscope to really be able to ID them. There might be a new way to do it, and it's super new. And that is super exciting about the 19th century because very little is known about these papers specifically. So like if you're looking at a 17th or a 16th century manuscript, you can usually find the paper and the mill through the watermark. Embossments don't have that kind of control. And the mill's scholarship falls off in 1832 with John Bidwell. So it's kind of this weird, we don't know space. And the embossment is a way to start tracing these. So first you have to be able to see them. So in the digital scans, you see how they disappeared. And in person, it's hard to see them in that flat archive lighting. And so Deborah Mayer was the person who worked the system for the archive at the request of Leslie Morris, who's a curator at Houghton and responsible for the Dickinson collection there. So this was Deborah's system, the side lighting, the window, the ruler, that allowed you to just see what was there. And then with an iPhone, which are allowed in archives, you can get a really magnified visual on it and start to see what's there. And as you might note, the images are often images of empire. Here's a little array. These are just things I've taken. I think these were taken at Amherst, judging from that ruler background. And the background is not inches, but centimeters. So they're really, really small. They're like the size of your thumbnail, maybe. And once you can identify them, you can trace them. And tracing them is important because a lot of these papers were made very close in proximity to where Dickinson lived. In Holyoke, in Dalton, in South Lee, on the Connecticut River, and on the Housatonic River. And Massachusetts was a big center for writing paper because of its ample, clean water, which was reconceived of as a commodity during this time, not as an interconnection between tribal cultures and a life-sustaining thing. It was seen as something that was only half used in Holyoke because they didn't have enough manufacturers yet. And so it plays into a lot of really important cultural dynamics that the Dickinson family is involved in directly. The scholar Lisa Brooks at Amherst has done the most work on this. Her essays and her books are just totally brilliant. If you haven't read them, The Common Pot is a great place to start. So it turns out that the things that I've been attending to in the quilts are things that women did in the mills. So in the 1860s, there were more women than men in the paper mills in Massachusetts. And paper was being produced in local mills, not by the ream, but by the ton. So like Whiting Mill produced 20 tons in a day. Parsons Mill, 19 tons of paper in a day. So when you start to think about who's touching these works, one woman is feeding these sheets that Dickinson writes on into an embosser. And an embosser in French, gaufre, it literally means waffle because you have these two parts that are coming together, pressing the paper in each direction, like a waffle maker. So it's a very good way to describe what these things are doing. And the fibers do it because of their fiber content, which is linen and cotton. So these images are taken at Crane Museum's archive in Dalton, Mass. I was just there yesterday. So these are fresh images. And they have 8 folders of rag, like what they call rag samples. And it is very, very interesting because so little is known about this paper. But for me, I'm really interested because if you can trace the paper to the mill and the rags to the mill, then you can trace the material histories of the materials in the paper. And it's not a stretch at all to say that these materials are very heavily entwined in the empire of cotton and all of its violence and all of the colonial violence around that. So when you look at Dickinson's paper, it's being made by women who live very nearby. These are the rag cutters. And it's being produced in huge quantities very nearby. And the quantity of rags you need to make 20 tons of paper each day is coming on ships, container ships by the ton. So rags are both locally sourced from textile mills, but also internationally sourced. So these things are crossing the Atlantic at least once, if not 2 or 3 times, given how that empire was manufactured to send the spinning and the weaving to Europe, if we're getting textiles back, there's no other way to explain what's in that paper. And I'm getting there. With the research I'm doing, but I'm been able to connect a lot of it up in very concrete ways through different archives. And I don't know where it's going. I don't know what I'll be making with it, but it's really fun to have a collaborator that I admire greatly. And so I kind of think of it right now as like, how can I help? Like, what do we need that doesn't exist? Who's it for? What's the, like, what do different audiences need from this research? And that's how I start to think iteratively. So I can think like, we need a better guide to the embossments than we have at this point in order to do Dickinson scholarship. That I can do, that's in my skill set. I know how to make indexes, and Deborah knows how to photograph at the macro level and set it up and hand it over to imaging services. And, so there's a lot of collaboration. Leslie Morris is willing to do it and is supporting it. So I'm excited about how it can keep moving into places that are unforeseen and then yeah, stay tuned. I don't know what will come of it. So thank you. Thank you, Lily, Shannon.
So we have some time for questions, discussion.
Jen, thank you. That's so fascinating. I love how you were just saying, look, I don't know the end of this project. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the beginning of a project. How does an obsession come to be a focus? And I imagine there are other obsessions that don't get picked up or maybe there's an account of something that seemed tangential that came to be central to another project. Curious about all of that. Thanks.
Thanks. I think like with the embossments, I start with the questions. Like, can we figure out where these are coming from? And if so, how? And can we actually get images where you can see what they are? And in all of this, like I am a little tiny part of a much bigger network of people who are expert in their fields and in their collections. So library fellowships have been huge for this project. I've been supported by Beinecke at Yale and Houghton Library and American Antiquarian Society. And to have time in all of those libraries and a little bit of financial support that goes with it, it literally, like, it gives you the space and the resources, and also the resources of the curators who know so much about their specific collections. So there are the questions that I come with, but then there are questions that the material starts to ask. Like I'll come across something and I won't understand it. And then then I have a new question. So I'm still on that sort of like, winding path. And I don't know what ends up in the work. And that's really like, it's not my problem yet. I don't have any deadlines. So, but I feel like a lot of the questions that I had early on, I now know some answers to, or I know how to find them. But one thing that Karen Emmerich said to me that I found really helpful was like, you just need to point. You don't need to answer every question. Like if you want someone to think about something, create something that asks that question. So I think that's kind of what the quilts are trying to do. And I feel like the paper research is trying to offer back that question, like what is the larger context of this paper and why is that not known? Why should it be known? Why is it relevant? What can we learn when we start to understand how it worked? And also, what can we learn about Dickinson's understanding of paper? And so looking at it like through that sort of concordance-like lens, I can say now that I actually understand why she capitalizes it and why she doesn't capitalize it. It means two different things, capitalized or uncapitalized, which is something I would have never in a million years gotten to had I not been looking in that way. And so like the difference, whether it was written or unwritten, is a difference. Whether there was, it also referred to a letter. The receipt of a letter, a written letter means one thing, the want of an unwritten letter means another. You know, so these are, and also the like printed journal, a newspaper, also a paper, but that sort of empty full or received or, yeah, it's a total surprise to me. Yeah.
Thank you for opening up your world to us. And I loved hearing about your adventures. And my question is about after the work is made, right? Because your process is so, you ask questions and then you have unknowns that you pursue and you bring other people into that and then you go back and work alone and create something. And I'm wondering about after you've created something, what kind of adventures do those objects and books and texts have that have come back to you then and then told you about their adventures? So.
I mean, that's a question for Shannon, right? Because a lot of this lives in libraries now. Like, that's my dirty little secret that like, I love making work for libraries. I love libraries. A lot of the work is researched in them. And I love that sort of one-on-one experience of being able to read a book and have it just that one-to-one relationship between an artist book and like the time I want to read it in. And they can think so wildly different from one another that as a container, it's a very flexible form. You can do a lot with it. So the way I often come back to them is that way. And I have to say, I kind of love being a little more connected to librarians now, largely through social media because, and now, you know, through personal relationship, because it used to be 10 years before I'd hear back about a book. Like it was literally 10 years before anyone talked about the desert after I made it in 2008. 2018, I heard the first sentence about the book, which is kind of cool. Like, I like that. But I also think about works as things that I'm responsible to. I'm responsible to share them. I'm responsible to care for them or find places for them to live that are, you know, not going to get leaked on or burn or, you know, that sort of thing. And I have a responsibility to the questions within a work. So often, like, there are little seeds that are in one project that lead to another. Like Sue Wei came from the Silk Poems research, but it was definitely not research for Silk Poems. It was its own thing and bigger than its own thing. So I think of it that way. And yeah. I think that like when I went to Crane, they're you know, they're specializing in security paper exclusively now. They sold off the sort of stationery side to another company, even though it's called Crane. So they literally they print the paper that currency is printed on. And when you start to look in detail at printed money, like they have this really cool like little macro camera that follows the detail of it. There are threads specific. There are things like, there's like the level of technology is super textile. And it, like the micro printing, there's magnetic ink, like there are all of these sort of material valences of currency that are wild. And when you think about that, like in relationship to the silk poem strand, like I think about that relationship too. But there's a new form of printing that they're doing that I think is something I want to follow up on. So like I already feel like there's a little seed there, but it looks almost like a textile, and it's like printed in this weird proprietary way in Malta. So I'm thinking about what that is, but I'm excited to say talk with Fiona Manetto about something like that, or Deborah about something like that. So, you know, who knows? Who knows what the things lead to or what they ask? But I know when I like really, when I'm really like, oh my God, oh my, like when I think of the thing that I want to share with lots of people that I really am excited to talk with, then I know that it's probably going to stick around for a while. But usually something has to hang on for at least a couple of years before it gets its time, to make sure that it's not just like exciting today and by the time I'm, 10 years into it, not exciting. So, yeah. I'm not proposing this as a way for you all to work, by the way. It's just what works for me.
Hi, thanks so much for that talk. My mind is just spinning. I'm going to leave here with so many reading recommendations. I really appreciate all this work that you presented to us. And one of the things I can't get out of my mind is this textile inspiration for software. And as somebody who lives inside a computer and also loathes computers, I am trying to figure out what to do with this. And I'm wondering if your arrival at this understanding about the fact of textile style punch cards as the foundation for the kinds of computing we do today has changed the way that you approach your work, including your poetic writing process or how you interact with computers. I'd just like you to expand on that point because I found it really stirring. Thanks.
I'm excited that it's new to you. And most people who weave already know that. And a lot of like the early computer science geeks know that too. So it's not that it's like rarefied information. It's pretty clear that there's a direct handoff between the two. But there's something weird to me in that it's like a physical punch card. It's the binary, it's the zeros and ones, so punched or unpunched. And when you get it on the level of the card, like the through or the not through, it's just weird to me that the two look so similar. And that the paper histories start to connect up to the textile histories. Like the paper for the punch card was made in the village that my wife was born in France, in Annecy. Which was also a paper making city. So there are all of these sort of weird, and it turns out that Byron Weston, who I was just researching the last couple of days, made the paper for the Social Security cards. So like my little, geeky research brain is exploding when I start to think about these sorts of things. Yeah. Hi, Mike. Librarian heroes in the room.
Thank you, Jen. I have a bunch of questions, but I guess just back to your process, which I think is so fascinating. And I'm curious to hear more about, like, have you noticed, I was just struck by how long it takes you and that you're talking about that duration of time. Have you noticed, like, are there patterns where, like, it takes you a certain amount of time to figure out what you're doing, to do the research? How do you know when you're done with the research and you're ready to start making? It seems like so much of it is about just like being open and vulnerable and not knowing, and that seems really hard. So I'm also just curious about like how you emotionally deal with that uncertainty.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I think more about how to balance like my home life and my research life, to not be gone too much, to be gone enough to really get somewhere when I'm researching, that kind of thing. Like how to go a year and just go to libraries. How's that going to work financially? These sorts of things. So, the thing that I can give a project is time. The thing I can give a project is like the stuff I make. But I'm a slow processor in every way. And I like that about my brain. I like fast processing brains too, and verbal processors, which I am not. Um, but it's just the way I am. And my attention goes where it goes without my having to try too hard. Working up the courage to ask took me a long time. I've gotten really good at just, both asking and teaching other people to ask. Like I'm very proud of the fact that I helped Ralph Angel, the poet, go up in a cherry picker because it was a lifelong dream of his because I just asked. These sorts of things. And I have to confess that when I first started the work with silk poems, like I felt like I had to know everything before I could even talk to Theo. So I did not know how to go about it. And so I've learned how to be a better collaborator and to be less shy about not knowing everything. I've also learned how to do my homework in advance much better, so that I do feel more confident going in. And I think that the interdisciplinarity of the work is also present in how I learn to do things that I don't know how to do. So like, one thing that I learned very recently from a really brilliant journalist was how to research patents, for example, how to use ChatGPT to research mills. It turns out it's pretty good at it. And that it's obvious, but like the work toggles between technology and Luddite stuff all the time. And so it's a matter of trying to figure out like what tools work best for what. And turns out I don't actually want to spend an hour digging to figure out where Holyoke Paper Company's archives are. They're in Amherst. But, like if ChatGPT can tell me like as soon as I can get the question in, great. Yeah. So does that answer your question? I never thought I'd be using that, by the way.
Is it on? Hi.
Hi.
This is a little related to the question she just asked, because I was thinking about when you're working with the Chinese poem, I think the first thing I thought of was I would never have been able to give myself permission because there's a cultural language, like I could be interested in it, but and so I just wondered if you had anything more about the cultural barriers and, being this white lady coming in and, saying, oh, this is what this is about. And we are now going to make a documentary about this. And so if you could just talk about some of that, even though when you started, it maybe wasn't as much of part of the culture as it is today.
Yeah, I mean, positionality is really important in any work. And especially with Su Hui, like it's a Chinese poem in every way, in how it thinks and how it, in its world. And so, you know, my first step was like, is there any work about this poem? Like, what can I read? What can I look at? And it felt really like a poem that was under-recognized. And a lot of the women that we spoke with in China were not familiar with it. Or if they were familiar with like the novel that was written about it, or you know, some other form. And, you know, everyone that we spoke with had that feeling too of just like, why don't we know this poem? You know, and I have ideas about why that's the case. But in the finished work, it was really important to Charlotte and I to sort of build a nest around the poem. That's a documentary approach that comes from her, but also to center the voices of Chinese women talking about the poem. So it's not, you know, it's weird when I present because it's me, blah, 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 you know, talking up here, but in the work, you're encountering the poem being sewn, the two finished embroideries, this chorus of voices discussing different, you know, perspectives on the poem from their perspective. So it's, well, you know, we have a hand in the staging of it. It's really important to me that the centering of Su Hui and the centering of women's voices is the piece. But it's tricky, you know, like it also means that when that work is being shown, that it's really clear to whoever's about to present it who made it, so that, you know, that they're aware that it's two white women, you know, who worked with translators and worked with producers in China to create it. I think that's really important, that that's known. Yeah.
No, I mean, it's clear. I'm not,
Yeah.
this is not a critique, it's just
No, it's,
that would, it's part of what you were saying before, that shyness and,
yeah,
you know, can I ask?
yeah,
Can I point myself in that direction?
right. Well, I think it came from like, this is something I really want to exist.
Yeah.
And if no one else is going to exist it, I'm going to do the thing that I can do, and hopefully other people will take it up. So rather than like trying to make the perfect work or the authoritative work, I'm very against that. Like, we are all just like little tiny steps in all of this. And so I hope my step is a good one, but I hope that there will be steps after it, that it joins a conversation. So yeah, that's what's cool about writing in time and making in time. Yeah.
Jen, we have a question from the Zoom universe. What is your behind-the-scenes system for tracking projects and recording your research over multiple projects, such as sketchbooks, journals, even your studio setup? It's just a small question at the end here.
It's top secret. I can't answer that. I don't know. It's really hard with this research because it's super visual. So like I need to be able to tag images, and I haven't figured out how to do that. So I almost think it might be like more of a digital humanities project in the research side of it. I don't know how to do that yet. I'm pretty good at figuring out where I need to go to answer questions or how to track down people. Okay, I just have to say how excited I am that next weekend I am going to a retirement home in New Hampshire to visit the guy who wrote the book on 19th century mills, to see his personal collection. Because when he was citing it, he said, referred to hereafter as Owen and Hurlbut correspondence. And I was like, but where is it? And so I wrote to him and he's like, oh, I have it in a binder. It's like, can I come? And she's like, yeah, bring snacks. So that's next Sunday. Yeah. Um,
Amazing. Thank you
Yeah.
so much.
So that's not telling you how I organize it. I try. That's my answer. I try.
Thank you so much, Jen, for being here today and sharing your work with us in this really beautiful way. We have the 6 books that Jen has created with Granary Books in special collections here at Smith, so I encourage you to come visit if you haven't already seen them. And right after this, over in Wright Hall at the Poetry Center, we have a reception. We invite you all to come over. And then in the meantime, just let's give Jen Bervin a round of applause and thanks for this wonderful talk.